Alright, in this video, I wanted to discuss the process of fermentation. And fermentation is a unique process that occurs as part of cellular respiration in specific environments. So we want to go over the details of fermentation and how and why it occurs. So let's go ahead and get started. So fermentation is a process that occurs anaerobically. And anaerobic just is a way of saying without oxygen. So when an organism doesn't have access to oxygen, it can't perform the full scope of cellular respiration. And rather, they have to do this process instead. Okay. So this process allows the organism to produce 2 ATP for every glucose molecule that we start with. But if we think back to cellular respiration as a whole, that's not nearly as good. So you might recall that overall, cellular respiration should produce somewhere between 34 and 38 ATP molecules for every glucose that we began with. So we got to figure out why an organism would do this process that only makes 2 ATP, when it, in theory, it could be doing this other process that could make 34 to 38 ATP. Getting 34 to 38 would be way better. So why are we making only 2? We're going to try to answer that question. All right, so during the process of fermentation, we're going to see that fermentation is a specific chemical reaction that converts the chemical pyruvate to either lactic acid or ethanol. All right, so we'll talk about those 2 different processes. And along the way, this chemical reaction, converting pyruvate to lactic acid or ethanol, regenerates the chemical NAD+. And really, that's the important piece about fermentation, is that the chemical reaction of fermentation regenerates NAD+. So we're going to see why that occurs. All right, so in order to understand fermentation, we should just give a really quick overview of cellular respiration. So you'll recall that cellular respiration has 3 major steps. There's glycolysis. In my diagram, it's right up here, so it's highlighted yellow. Glycolysis converts glucose, our 6-carbon sugar, into 2 pyruvates, 3-carbon molecules. Right. Glycolysis is followed by the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle occurs down here in the mitochondria, where we convert the pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and then we put the acetyl-CoA through the Krebs cycle. Right. These 2 processes, glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they produce some ATP. We made 2 ATP during glycolysis, and then down here, we make 2 ATP during the Krebs cycle. In this diagram, it's called GTP, but for our purposes, those 2 are completely equivalent. So we've made a little bit of ATP, but what we have produced a lot of are these NADH molecules. We made 2 here, 2 when we converted pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and then 6 when we did the Krebs cycle. We also made FADH2, which pretty much serves the exact same function. Remember, these NADH molecules are electron carriers, and their job is to carry the electrons to the last step of cellular respiration, the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. And that occurs right down here. So here we see the NADH dropping off the electrons at our electron transport chain. We're going to move those hydrogen ions, creating a hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and then using that hydrogen ion concentration gradient, we can make all those ATP that cellular respiration makes. So this step makes over 30 ATP molecules. All right, so that's what normally happens. So why would we ever do fermentation, this process that only makes 2 ATP molecules? So let's reflect on the precise role of oxygen in the overall cellular respiration process. Remember, fermentation happens when there is no oxygen. So what is oxygen doing? You might recall that oxygen is the terminal electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. So if we look down here in the electron transport chain, we see oxygen right here. So oxygen acts at the end of this electron transport chain. It accepts some electrons, and when that occurs, we create a water molecule. If oxygen is not here, the electron transport chain cannot function. it has nowhere to put the electrons at the end of the process, and the whole electron transport chain stops. Remember, this electron transport chain, along with chemiosmosis, creates most of the ATP that cellular respiration creates. So this is going to turn into a big problem. Without oxygen, we can't run the electron transport chain, and we can't make most of that ATP. All right. The electron transport chain also does something else really important. It interacts with the NADH and NAD molecules. So as a reminder, if the electron transport chain is not functioning, if oxygen's not there, this whole electron transport chain is not working, including the very first step of the electron transport chain, where we take electrons off of NADH, regenerating this NAD molecule. Right? If the electron transport chain is not functioning, we can't do that step. Right? NADH will not be converted to NAD+. So that's going to create an additional problem. The problems are just cascading. So without oxygen, the electron transport chain doesn't work. Without the electron transport chain working, we don't regenerate that NAD+ chemical. What problem does that create? Well, these earlier steps in cellular respiration, glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they require NAD. Every step in cellular respiration prior to the electron transport chain requires NAD+. So we see that here in glycolysis. We can see that here in the step where we convert pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. And we see that right here during the Krebs cycle. If there is no NAD+, because we're not unloading electrons from NADH at the electron transport chain, well then these three steps also stop. So in the absence of oxygen, the electron transport chain stops. And that means that the Krebs cycle, this conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and glycolysis also stop. Okay, so without oxygen, and thus NAD+, cellular respiration grinds to a complete halt, and we cannot make any energy. So without oxygen, we can't make any ATP using the normal cellular respiration process. That's bad, right? Without ATP, a cell can't perform its required functions, and that cell will die. So what can we do to solve this problem? So that's where fermentation comes into play. Fermentation is going to help us solve this problem. We're going to be able to create a little bit of energy in the absence of oxygen. So what goes on? Fermentation specifically replenishes that required NAD+ molecule. Okay. So we can see fermentation taking place up here in the upper right corner. Fermentation is going to convert this C3 molecule, that's pyruvate, anaerobically, without oxygen, into either lactic acid or we can convert it to ethanol. But no matter which one we do, we use up NADH and we produce NAD. So if we're converting pyruvate to ethanol, we use up NADH and we produce NAD. Okay. So the conversion of pyruvate to lactic acid or ethanol requires NADH. Then we get back our NAD. If we convert pyruvate to one of these products and we replenish NAD, we can feed that NAD right back into glycolysis, right up here, and continue that process. So during fermentation, glycolysis can continue. We don't do any of these other steps at the bottom. We only do glycolysis, and then the pyruvate that we make, we convert anaerobically into acid or alcohol. But you'll recall that glycolysis produces these two ATP molecules. So that's where we get two ATP molecules from each glucose when we're doing fermentation. You'll notice the fermentation reaction itself doesn't create the two ATP. The fermentation reaction creates the NAD that allows glycolysis to continue. All right. So for each glucose we start with, we produce two ATP. So that's the benefit of fermentation. When there isn't oxygen and cellular respiration cannot occur, right? In the absence of oxygen, cellular respiration cannot occur. When that's the case, when there isn't oxygen, fermentation can step in, and we can still produce 2 ATP from each glucose. So this happens in your body. Fermentation can take place in muscle. This happens when you perform vigorous exercise, right? If you sprint, your muscles consume all the oxygen really fast, and your heart and lungs and circulatory system can't deliver enough oxygen to your muscles fast enough to make sure that your muscles have all the oxygen they need. So instead of just stopping moving, your muscles can do fermentation. Right? So your muscles perform fermentation to get the energy, and as a byproduct, they produce lactic acid. So again, if you do really vigorous exercise and you deplete the oxygen in your muscles, fermentation happens, you get energy still, so you can keep moving your muscles, but you produce lactic acid. That lactic acid has an important side effect. That's the chemical that causes the burning sensation in our muscles when we exercise intensely. So if you've ever done like a sprint workout, you might find that your muscles burn for a little while. That's because there's lactic acid in there, burning the muscles. Right, so that's fermentation in muscles. I just want to quickly point out that fermentation happens in other organisms as well, right? Microbes like yeast and bacteria can also perform fermentation. They produce a number of food products that we use when they do fermentation. So for example, if you put yeast into a liquid mixture full of sugars, and you can produce things like beer. So beer is a product of fermentation. The alcohol is made by the yeast because they're doing fermentation. Here we've got yogurt. Yogurt is a food product produced by fermentation. There are bacteria that live on the yogurt. They're consuming the milk sugars and they're converting them to lactic acid. That's why yogurt has a little bit of a tangy flavor. It's from the acid that's in there. Here's a picture of wine being produced. Wine is basically when you add yeast to grape juice. The yeast feed off of all the sugar in the grape juice, but they run out of oxygen, they do fermentation, and they produce alcohol as a byproduct. Another one would be baking. So here's some dough that is rising, and this dough has a big bubble in it. So that bubble is from the yeast consuming the sugars in the dough, doing fermentation. They're producing some alcohol, but when we bake the bread, the alcohol all cooks off. But along the way, they also produce some carbon dioxide. And that's why we get the bubbles, the air bubbles inside our bread. It's actually bubbles of carbon dioxide. They're produced by the yeast that are doing fermentation. Last here is an example are cheeses. Cheeses are another food that's produced oftentimes with fermentation. Microbes, again, are living on the cheese, consuming some of the dairy sugar, converting it to acid, which helps give each individual cheese its distinct flavor. So, fermentation is a really important process. I hope this video helps you understand how and why it occurs. As always, if you have questions, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them, and I'll talk to you again soon.